Massacre at Fort Mackinac, based on eyewitness accounts of Alexander Henry. This was edited by Dennis M. Morrison. Introduction. The Great Lakes region has a rich history steeped in the traditions of the woodland cultures and enhanced by the traditions of the first Europeans to visit our shores. When these two cultures met, conflicts were sure to develop, and they did, sometimes with great violence. The area's prehistory has many accounts of bloodshed. The Indians coveted this paradisiacal land. They fought for it and possessed it. Tribe vanquished tribe in their lust for the rich green woodlands abounding with streams and lakes. When the first whites arrived, they must have been viewed with suspicion and perhaps considered as competition. Of course, the French and the English made inroads and established forts. One of the bloodiest chapters during that period where the cultures commingled is that of the massacre at Fort Mackinac. In the Great Lakes, I believe this chapter in history is unparalleled for deception. Winds of discontent. The English had barely taken Fort Mackinac from the French when the Indians, dissatisfied with English rule and led by Chief Pontiac, rose to rebel in the spring of 1763. During this uprising, the Indians captured 8 of the forts. Detroit was the only fort west of Niagara that did not depart from the hands of the English. The fort and trading post at the Straits of Mackinac was known as Fort Michilimackinac. This was a lonely outpost that was hacked out of the dense northern wilderness. During the very long winter months, the fort was usually icebound and cut off from all other settlements. The fort was so close to the water that when the winds from the west came up, the waves would actually break against the stockade. Fort Michilimackinac was not a fort in the commonly understood way. It was intended to offer only a small measure of protection from surprise attack by the Indians. The arrows and the musket balls which the natives used made little more than a dent in the solid cedar palisade. The fort was a valuable military vantage point which guarded the gateway to the 3 upper Great Lakes. It was a bustling center for the fur trade. Animal fur, particularly beaver, was a source of great wealth. It was the chief industry of Canada and the principal cause for the whites being in the area in the first place. The feeling of the natives towards their English guardians is best described by Raymond McCoy in his book Massacre at the Old Fort Mackinac. Mr. McCoy related, although the war between the French and the British was now over and the British had come into possession of the country, the Indian inhabitants were far from resigned to the outcome. The French had given up their claim, but the Indians, who held a far older claim to the country, had no intentions of surrendering theirs. Not to the hated English at any rate. Although unsteady in their loyalty, the tribesmen around the Great Lakes, except the Fox tribe of Wisconsin, had for the most part lived on good terms with the French. They had fought on their side during their long series of wars with the English for possession of the Indians' lands, and they still adorned their war dress with the scalp locks of dead Englishmen. Considering all of this, the stage was set for something to happen. But how could the Indians, with their weapons, breach the fort? Treachery was the only possible way. While months passed, the Indians maintained an outward appearance of friendship toward the British, but their contempt never diminished. The English just outright used them badly. The happy-go-lucky French respected their peculiar customs and beliefs. The British could only treat them with contempt and complain about their hanging around the fort. The French bestowed gifts on the Indians, such as blankets, muskets, hatchets, knives, powder, shot, tobacco, and kettles. This kept the relationship good. The British, as a rule, did none of this. The situation was worsened by the compilation for the animals available to be trapped. Or competition, I should say. Again, Mr. McCoy states the situation aptly. The British fur traders were not as considerate or well-mannered as those of the French. Under the more liberal British trading regulations, permits to trade were issued to everyone who wanted them, and the woods swarmed with competing traders, some of them of the most ruthless variety. The pressure of competition was tremendous, and in a region where law meant but little, the traders fought amongst themselves and cheated and plundered the unsophisticated Indians, underweighing their furs, or were charging them for goods and trading them liquor that was highly diluted with water. The Gathering Attack. I am fortunate enough to own a copy of the book The American Indian, Their History by Mr. Henry R. Schoolcraft and published in 1851. Printed therein is an account written by Alexander Henry, who himself was captured at the fort and was one of the few British survivors of the attack. Let's pick up the story with his sometimes frightening first-hand account. When I arrived at Mackinac, I found several other traders who had arrived there before me from different parts of the country, and who in general declared the disposition of the Indians to be hostile to the English, and were even fearful of a coming attack. Mr. Laurent Duchamar distinctly informed Major Etherington that a plan was absolutely conceived for destroying him, his garrison, and all of the English in the upper country, but the commandant, believing this and other reports to be without foundation, he proceeded only from the idle or ill disposed persons and of a tendency to do mischief, expressed much displeasure against Mr. Ducharme, and threatened to send the next person who should bring a story of the same kind as a prisoner to Detroit. The garrison at this time consisted of 90 privates, 2 subalterns, and the commandant, and the English merchants at the fort were 4 in number. Thus strong, few entered anxiety concerning the Indians who had no weapons but small arms. Still obvious signs were being overlooked. The account continues. The Indians from every quarter were daily assembling in unusual numbers, but with the appearance of friendship, frequenting the fort and disposing of their peltries in such a manner to dissipate almost anyone's fears. For myself, on one occasion, I took the liberty of observing to Major Etherington that in my judgment no confidence ought to be placed in them, and that I was informed no less than 400 Indians lay around the fort. Of course, the Major ignored the concerns expressed by Mr. Henry. It must be noted, for it becomes important later, that Alexander Henry, a year earlier, became good friends with a Chippewa named Wawatam. In fact, Wawatam's entire family befriended and brought him gifts regularly. Wawatam told Alexander that, on this occasion, he had dreamed of adopting an Englishman as his son, brother, and friend, that in the moment he first beheld me, he recognized me as the person whom the Great Spirit had been pleased to point out to him for a brother, that he hoped that I would not refuse his present, and that he should forever regard me as one of his family. I could not do otherwise than accept the present, and declare my willingness to have so good a man as this appeared to be, for my friend and my brother. Now a full 12 months had elapsed from that event till the day in question. Wawatam came again to Mr. Henry after leaving his wintering grounds. He was almost insistent that Henry leave Fort Michilimackinac right away and go with him and his family to Sault Ste. Marie, some 50 miles away, where there might be relative safety. Mr. Henry did not heed that advice. Alexander Henry's narrative continues. In the course of that same day, I observed that the Indians came in great numbers into the fort, purchasing tomahawks, small axes of 1 pound weight, and frequently desiring to see silver armbands and other valuable ornaments, of which I had a large quantity for sale. The ornaments, however, they in no instance purchased, but after turning them over, left them, saying that they would call again the next day. Their motive, as it afterward appeared, was no other than discovering, by requesting to see them, the particular places of their deposit, so that they might lay their hands on them in the moment of pillage with the greater certainty of dispatch. And now the attack. Wawatam had come to Alexander Henry during the day and warned him without actually saying there was going to be an attack. That night Mr. Henry thought of Wawatam and his air of impending doom, but decided there was really nothing to do, or nothing to it. The next day was the 4th of June. It was the King of England's birthday. It was also a day that the English would see just how treacherous the native Americans could be. Henry's account, a truly descriptive and brilliant narrative, continues. The morning was sultry. A Chippewa came to to tell me that this nation was going to play at Bagatawag with the Sacs or the Sox, another Indians nation, for a high wager. He invited me to witness the sport, adding that the commandant was to be there, and he would be on the side of the Chippewas. In consequence of this information, I went to the commander and expostulated with him a little bit, representing that the Indians might possibly have some sinister end in view, but the commandant only smiled at my suspicions. Bagatywig is played with a bat and ball. The bat is about 4 feet in length, curved, and terminating in a sort of racket. 2 posts are planted in the ground at considerable distance from each other, as much as a mile or more. Each team had its post, and the game consists of throwing the ball up to the post of the adversary. The ball at the beginning is placed in the middle of the course, and each party endeavors as well to throw the ball out of the direction of its own post as into that of the adversaries. I did not go out myself to see the match, which was to be played out without the fort, because there being a canoe prepared to depart on the morning of the following day for Montreal. I employed myself in writing letters to my friends, even when a fellow trader, Mr. Tracy, happened to call upon me, saying that another canoe had just arrived from Detroit, and proposing that I should go with him to the beach to inquire the news. And it so happened that I still remained to finish my letters, promising to follow Mr. Tracy in the course of a few minutes. Mr. Tracy had not gone more than 20 paces from the door when I heard an Indian cry and a noise of general confusion. Alexander Henry's report reminds me of CNN coverage today. He tells things graphically as they unfold with decisive precision. Going instantly to my window, I saw a crowd of Indians within the fort furiously cutting down and scalping every Englishman they found. In particular, I witnessed the fate of Lieutenant Jamet. I had in the room in which I was a fowling piece loaded with swan shot. This I immediately seized and held it for a few minutes, waiting to hear the drum beat to arms. In this dreadful interval, I saw several of my countrymen fall, and more than one struggling between the knees of an Indian, who, holding him in this manner, scalped him while he was yet living. At length, disappointed in the hope of seeing resistance made to the enemy, and sensible of course that no effort of my own unassisted arm could avail against 400 Indians, I thought only of seeking shelter. Amid the slaughter which was raging, I observed many of the Canadian inhabitants of the fort calmly looking on, neither opposing the Indians nor suffering injury, and from the circumstances I conceived a hope of finding security in their houses. It was obvious by this statement that no one was targeted except the English. This fact is bore out as we read more of the journal, which continues, "Between the yard door of my house and that of M. Langlade, my next-door neighbor, there was only a low fence over which I easily climbed. At my entrance I found the whole family at the windows gazing at the scene of blood before them. I addressed myself immediately to Mr. Langlade, begging that he would that he put me in some safe place until the heat of the affair should be over, an act of charity by which he might perhaps preserve me from my general massacre." But while I uttered my position, Mr. Langlade, who looked for a moment at me, turned again to the window, shrugging his shoulders and intimating that he could do nothing for me. The horror the Englishman must have felt as he realized what was happening to his countrymen, and he himself was seeking shelter, only to meet with indifference from those he thought might give him aid. One cannot judge Mr. Langlade harshly, as he had his family and his own life to watch out for. With what was unfolding before him, why would he have led his own life and family into danger? But there was hope for Alexander Henry. This was a moment of despair, but the next, a Pawnee woman, the Pawnees are an Indian nation to the south, a slave of Mr. Langlade's, beckoned to me to follow her. She brought me to a door which she opened, desiring me to enter and telling me that it led to the garret where I must go and conceal myself. I joyfully obeyed her directions, and she, having followed me up to the garret door, locked it after me, and with great presence of mind took away the key. This shelter helped to preserve Alexander Henry physically, yet it did not spare his eyes the horror of what was taking place outside. His graphic account continues. I was anxious to know what might still be passing without. Through an aperture which afforded me a view of the fort, I beheld in shapes the foulest and most terrible the ferocious triumphs of the barbarian conquerors. The dead were scalped and mangled, the dying were writhing and shrieking under the unsatisfied butcher blade of the tomahawk, and from the bodies of some, ripped open, their butchers were drinking the blood, scooped up in a hollow of joined hands, and quaffed among shouts of rage and victory. I was shaken not only with horror, but also fear. The suffering which I witnessed, I seemed on the point of experiencing. No long time elapsed before everyone, being destroyed who could be found, there was a general cry of all is finished. At the same instant I heard some Indians enter the house in which I was. The garret was separated from the room below only by a layer of single boards, at once the flooring of the one and the ceiling of the other. I could therefore hear everything that passed, and the Indians no sooner came in than they inquired whether or not any Englishmen were in the house. Mr. Langlade replied that he could not say, he did not know of any, answers which did not exceed the truth, for the Pawnee woman had not only hidden me by stealth, but had kept my secret and her own. Mr. Langlade was therefore, as I presume, as far from a wish to destroy me as he was careless about saving me, when he added to these answers that they might examine for themselves, and would soon be satisfied as to the object of their questions. Saying this, he brought them to the garret door. The state of mind will be imagined. Arrived at the door, some delay was occasioned by the absence of a key, and a few moments were thus allowed me in which to look around for a hiding place. In one corner of the garret was a heap of those vessels of birch bark used in maple sugar making. The door was unlocked and opened, and the Indians ascending the stairs before I had completely crept into the small opening which presented itself at one end of the heap. An instant after, 4 Indians entered the room, all armed with tomahawks, and all besmeared with blood upon every part of their bodies. The die appeared to be cast. I could scarcely breathe, but I thought the throbbing of my heart occasioned a noise so loud as to betray me. The Indians walked in every direction about the garret, and one of them approached me so closely that at a particular moment he had put forth his hand. He must have touched me. Amazingly, Mr. Henry managed to elude the hunters, but the next day proved to be his downfall. It seems the Indians, not finding his carcass among the spoils, set out on a thorough search for him. Mr. Langlade, at the urging of his wife, decided to give Mr. Henry over to the Indians rather than have him discovered in their home, and perhaps having his children bear part of the Indians' wrath at learning this. Alexander heard these designs from his hiding place, and his journal continues. I now resigned myself to the fate which I was to be menaced, and regarding every attempt at concealment in vain, I arose from the bed and presented myself in full view of the Indians who were entering the room. They were all in a state of intoxication and entirely naked in the middle. One of them, named Winaway, whom I had previously known, and who was upward of 6 feet in height, had his entire face and body covered with charcoal and grease, only that a white spot of 2 inches in diameter encircled either eye. This man walked up to me, seized me with one hand by the collar and coat, while in the other he held a large carving knife, as if to plunge it in my breast. His eyes, meanwhile, were fixed steadfastly on mine. At length, after some seconds, he dropped his arm, saying he would not kill me. To this he added that he frequently engaged in wars against the English, and had brought away many scalps, that on a certain occasion he had lost a brother whose name was Mackinac, and that I should be called after him. So Mr. Henry received a reprieve of sorts for the time being. He was allowed by Winaway to stay in the home of the Langlades until the current danger passed. This security, however, was much shorter lived than was hoped for, as in the space of an hour another Indian came to the house claiming to represent Winaway and insisting that Mr. Henry accompany him. The Indian on this part directed that before I left the house I should undress myself, declaring that my coat and shirt would become him better than they did me. His pleasure in this respect being complied with, no other alternative was left to me than either to go out naked or to put on the clothes of the Indian, which he freely gave to me in exchange. As affairs turned out, Mr. Major Etherington, Mr. Bostwick, and Lieutenant Leslie, plus 20 Englishmen, including some soldiers, were left alive. The prisoners were marched to the lakeside where a canoe was ready to depart. Mr. Henry remarked on this in his journal. Our voyage, full of doubts as it was, would have commenced immediately, but that one of the Indians who was to be part of the party was late. His arrival was to be waited for, and this occasioned a very long delay, during which we were exposed to a keen northeast wind. An old shirt was all that covered me. Lust for material was the same then as it is now in some cases. It's all that mattered, as we see from this continuing commentary. I suffered much from the cold, and in this extremity Mr. Langlade came down to the beach. I asked him for a blanket, promising if I lived to pay him for it any price he pleased. But the answer I received was this, that he could not let me have a blanket unless there was someone to be security for payment. For myself, I observed I no longer had any property in that country. Mr. Henry's request was, however, granted by a less materialistic Canadian named John Cochose. At noon the party embarked for Beaver Island in Lake Michigan. In transit about every 20 minutes, the Indian captors were said to have let out a war whoop, one for each of the prisoners they carried. This was a custom which allowed all the other Indians within hearing distance to be aware of how many prisoners were being transported. Alexander Henry wrote, "In this manner we reached Wagoshensi and Fox Point, a long point stretching westward into the lake, in which the Ottawas make a carrying place to avoid going around it. It is distant 18 miles from Mackinac." After the Indians had made their way or their war whoop as before, an Ottawa appeared upon the beach, who made signs that we should land. In consequence, we approached. The Ottawa asked news and kept the Chippewa in further conversation till we were within a few yards of the land and in shallow water. At this moment 100 Indians rushed upon us from the bushes and dragged all the prisoners out of the canoe amid terrifying shouts. In the hands of friends? As the 100 or so Indians dragged Henry and his fellow prisoners from their canoe, they must have thought that at last their suffering was about to be ended. This must have conjured visions in their minds of the bloodshed that they had seen during the siege at Fort Mackinac, but Alexander Henry and his comrades found that the Ottawa were friendly to their cause and took possession of them, returning to Fort Mackinac. There were sufficient numbers of Ottawa that they took the fort from the Chippewas. A solemn council or summit was then convened between the two tribes, only to once more find Henry and company back in the hands of their original captors. Can you get a sense of how nerve-wracking this must have been? On their Ottawa captors, Henry wrote, "The Ottawas had themselves declared later that they had no other designs than to make broth of us." Something I'd like to point out here is that I personally have spoken with a number of experts who state emphatically that cannibalism never took place in the Great Lakes. No doubt they have not read or paid attention to the historic record. Remember how Alexander Henry wrote that during the actual massacre of the savages were actually cupping their hands and drinking the blood of their victims. This above passage proves that consuming other humans was practiced on occasion in the Great Lakes region. To these ends is another disgusting observation that Mr. Henry made and recorded in his journal. He said, "I confess that in the canoe with the Chippewas I was offered bread, but bread with what accompaniment? They had a loaf which they cut with small knives that they had employed in the massacre, knives still covered with blood. The blood they moistened with spittle, and rubbing it on the bread offered this for food to the prisoners, telling them to eat the blood of their countrymen." Accounts such as these are a matter of historic record and were written by respected people of the time. Why then make out that the Indian culture of the Great Lakes was at all times quite civilized at that point in history, when in fact history bears out that quite the opposite, that they could be quite barbaric? Salvation at last. Remember my telling you earlier about Wawatam, who had taken Alexander Henry as part of his family due to the vision he had. Mr. Henry's situation on the 7th of June 1763 seemed dire. He had been on an up-and-down roller coaster ride since before the attack, and just when all seemed lost, Wawatam came back on the scene. Alexander wrote, "Toward noon, when the great war chief and the company of Winaway was seated at the opposite end of the lodge, my friend and brother Wawatam suddenly came in. During the 4 days preceding I had often wondered what had become of him. In passing by he gave me his hand, but went immediately toward the great chief, and by the side of whom he and Winaway sat themselves down. The most uninterrupted silence prevailed. Each smoked his pipe. When this was done, Wawatam arose and left the lodge, saying to me as he passed, "Take courage." An hour elapsed, during which several chiefs entered, and preparations appeared to be in the making for a council. At length Wawatam re-entered the lodge, followed by his wife, and both loaded with merchandise, which they carried up to the chiefs and laid in a heap before them. Wawatam, through this and eloquent speech, was able to take Alexander Henry, and eventually Mr. Henry gained his freedom. Savage cannibalism in the Great Lakes region. Earlier I mentioned cannibalism, and I'd like to share with you perhaps the most disgusting account which Alexander Henry observed. This particular should serve as a lesson of sorts to those today who argue that it was the white man who was so brutal to the Indians. I doubt that even those whites who participated in the atrocities of Wounded Knee would come or could have ever matched this incident, though I'm not diminishing the horror of Wounded Knee and what the Native American people experienced there. Mr. Henry wrote, "In the course of the next morning I was alarmed by a noise in the prison lodge, and looking through the opening of the lodge in which I was, I saw 7 dead bodies of white men dragged forth. Upon my inquiry into the occasion, I was informed that a certain chief called by the Canadians the Grand Sable had not long before arrived from his winter hunt, and that he, having been absent when the war began, and being now desirous of manifesting to the Indians at large his hearty concurrence in what they had done, had gone into the prison lodge, and there with his knife put 7 men whose bodies I had seen to death. Shortly after 2 of the Indians took one of the dead bodies, which they chose as being the fattest, cut off the head, and divided the whole into 5 parts, one of which was put into each of the 5 kettles hung over as many fires kindled for the purpose at the door of the prison lodge, with an invitation to Wawatam to assist at the feast. An invitation to the feast is given by him who is master of it. Small cuttings of cedar wood, about 4 inches in length, supply of the place cards, and the bearer, by word of mouth, states the particulars. Wawatam obeyed the summons, taking with him, as usual, the place of entertainment, his dish and spoon. After an absence of about a half an hour, he returned, bringing in his dish of a human hand and a large piece of flesh. He did not appear to relish the repast, but told me that it was then, and always had been, the custom among the Indian nations when returning from war or overcoming enemies to make a war feast from among the slain. This, he said, inspired the warriors with courage and attack, and bred him to meet death with fearlessness. In closing, there was much more to the captivity of Alexander Henry. He wrote a great deal about his life among the Indians as he lived with his adopted family. He did later gain complete freedom. These, however, are the events which took place during the massacre at Fort Mackinac, as he witnessed and recorded them.